So, ladies and gentlemen, J. Cole talked about why he believes that it's harder than ever to put out a classic album in this day and age. And we got to talk about if he has a point and what exactly makes it so hard. But before we do, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button. So, J. Cole sat down for an interview where they discussed why they believe it's so difficult to put out a classic album, an album that's considered universally a classic. It's so much harder in this day and age. And he brought up several points as to why he believes that's the case. One being that music has become more divided and more cult like than ever. So people may not really want to give credit to a certain album if it's tied to an artist that they can't stand no matter what. And I think that's a fair point, but I also think there's other things at play. And the biggest thing to me is just simply the fact that not just in hip hop and music in general, I don't think there's ever truly been a moment where people are actually on the same page on what is the criteria for a classic album. People talk about what albums specifically they think are classics, but again, nobody ever talks about criteria. They just really base it off of vibes. It's just strictly vibe based. You're just going off of which albums you personally feel were good enough to be in the classic category. So you might feel like Biggie's Ready to Die or something like that would be considered a classic. But again, nobody's ever truly agreed or really discussed what would make it a classic. So what's so interesting to me is that a lot of this so-called culture has like a hive mind mentality where they always want to agree on certain things, and then if you disagree they attack you like you're some sort of monster. But surprisingly, this is one of the few things that I don't think people actually have a hive mind mentality on, and they don't, because again, most people don't even bother talking about what they think would make for a classic album. Like, my personal definition of a classic album would be an album that it's an above average album that at least 80% of the album is considered non-skippable. So translation, at least 80% of the album is high enough in quality to where you wouldn't want to skip through certain songs. Like, you don't feel like there's a lot of filler, basically. Another criteria I would say is if it ages well, which is something that you usually can't determine immediately. That's why I think we should not rush to say certain albums are like an instant classic, right? Because it's better, in my opinion, to give it a little time to breathe. You might need to wait 5 to 10 years to kind of see, like, how does it sound 10 years later? An album from 2003 might have sounded amazing, but then you might come back to it in 2026 and you're just like, man, some of the themes, some of the punchlines, some of the references, it feels very dated. So that could happen as well. And I think that could make or break if it's a classic as well. Something else that I think could determine if something is a classic, and I think this last piece of criteria is more so optional. The last piece of criteria that I'm gonna say is, did the album have a noticeable influence on the next generation of artists? Now, I say this is optional because there's very few albums that actually do this. This is an extremely difficult thing to pull off. And the people that were interviewing J. Cole, they brought up a really good point where they said, yeah, like they mentioned Mobb Deep, for example. They said, even though Infamous by Mobb Deep is a classic, is Infamous really a genre shifting album? Not really. So that's why I think it's more so optional, because there's not really that many albums in all of music that were so game changing that it influenced the next generation, and on top of that, it actually caused like a ripple effect where we have to make sure that you're always written into the bigger story of hip hop history, right? Like, one album I would say would meet that criteria of having that ripple effect would be like maybe Dr. Dre's album The Chronic, because of that sound that became essentially synonymous with the prototypical West Coast sound to this day. Or maybe you would say like Kanye's College Dropout, because when you think about the fact that at that time, somebody who had the aesthetic and the song topics that Kanye had, where he had more of like that sort of conscious backpacker underground type style that was not mainstream at that time. And once he blew up, it kicked in the door, and a bunch of people in a similar lane were able to become very popular. But again, albums like that, they're very very rare, and because they're so rare, I don't think that should automatically be the criteria. But all the other stuff I think should be automatic. Like I think at least 80% of the album should be non-skippable, like just high quality music, whatever your definition of high quality music is. And then also, does it age well? Does it still sound good as the years go on? And because of that, I do think that it can be a bit difficult for artists in this day and age to put out something that's universally considered a classic, because people have shorter attention spans than ever. So even if you put out an album that's full of really good songs or mostly good songs, there's still a good chance that people are still going to skip through a bunch of songs just because they have short attention spans. They have the attention span of a gnat, basically. So they're not really trying to sit down and listen and digest an entire song. They just want to hear whatever one clip they heard on TikTok. And I think that could affect how people perceive what's a classic or not, right? And then also, in this day and age, and this goes to J. Cole's point, things are more fractured than ever, and not necessarily in a bad way. I actually think this is a good thing, that things are more fractured than ever, to where now people are not just relying on getting all their music from a radio station. You now have that abundance of music through social media, which I think is a good and a bad thing. But the good part of it is that you have the opportunity to fall into whatever lane that you specifically like and only listen to stuff in that lane, which is going to create a lot more cult classics. This is something J. Cole referred to as well. He called it niche classics, but I think he meant to say cult classics. And that's fine, because if you're somebody who doesn't listen to Yeet, you may not be aware of his fan base, but his fan base, they may listen to his album ADL and they may think like it's a classic. You may not be super familiar with Big Crit, but but if you talk to people who listen to Big Crit, they may tell you, hey, Forever is a Mighty Long Time is a classic. And I think the only people going forward who are realistically going to have a chance at maybe getting classics are going to be people who, and it's always been this case, it's going to be the people who are plugged into the machine, who get to the level of a J. Cole, which of course is going to be harder because, like J. Cole points out, because people want you to fail so badly, if they already don't like you because you had issues with somebody else that they have become a stan of, they're much less likely to want to give you your props and say that this album was a classic, right? So that would kind of take away from the universal classic label that J. Cole's talking about. But another point J. Cole brought up that I thought was a good point is, hey, it might be your best shot to be in that position where people haven't begun to hate you just yet. So basically, your debut album would probably be your best chance of having a classic if you're a mainstream artist. But if you're underground, I mean, no matter what, realistically, you're not going to have that universal classic, so to speak, because you really aren't going to be popular enough in the first place, which is fine. But that's just is what it is. But let me know